It was raining in Baltimore on October 3, 1849, but that didn't stop Joseph W. Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, from heading out to Gunners Hall, a public house bustling with activity. It was election day, and Gunners Hall served as a pop-up polling location for the 4th Ward polls. When Walker arrived at Gunners Hall, he found a man, delirious and dressed in shabby second-hand clothes, lying in the gutter. The man was semi-conscious and unable to move, but as Walker approached him, he discovered something unexpected. The man was Edgar Allan Poe. Worried about the health of the addled poet, Walker stopped and asked Poe if he had any acquaintances in Baltimore who might be able to help him. Poe gave Walker the name of Joseph E. Snodgrass, a magazine editor with some medical training. Immediately, Walker wrote Snodgrass a letter asking for help. On September 27th, almost a week earlier, Poe had left Richmond, Virginia, bound for Philadelphia, to edit a collection of poems for Marguerite St. Leon Loud, a minor figure in American poetry at the time. When Walker found Poe in delirious disarray outside of the polling place, it was the first anyone had heard or seen of the poet since his departure from Richmond. Poe never made it to Philadelphia to attend to his editing business, nor did he ever make it back to New York, where he had been living, to escort his aunt back to Richmond for his impending wedding. Poe was never to leave Baltimore, where he launched his career in the early 19th century. Again, and in the 4 days between Walker finding Poe outside the public house and Poe's death on October 7th, he never regained enough consciousness to explain how he had come to be found, in soiled clothes not his own, incoherent on the streets. Instead, Poe spent his final days wavering between fits of delirium, gripped by visual hallucinations. The night before his death, according to his attending physician, John J. Moran, Poe repeatedly called out for Reynolds, a figure who, to this day, remains a mystery. 1. Beating. In 1867, one of the first theories to deviate from either phrenitis or alcohol was published by biographer E. Oakes Smith in her article Autobiographic Notes, Edgar Allan Poe. At the instigation of a woman, Smith writes, who considered herself injured by him, he was cruelly beaten blow upon blow by a ruffian who knew of no better mode of avenging supposed injuries. It is well known that a brain fever followed. Other accounts also mention ruffians who had beaten Poe senseless before his death. Eugene Didier wrote in his 1872 article, The Grave of Poe, that while in Baltimore, Poe ran into some friends from West Point, who prevailed upon him to join them for drinks. Poe, unable to handle liquor, became madly drunk after a single glass of champagne, after which he left his friends to wander the streets. In his drunken state, he was robbed and beaten by ruffians and left insensible in the street all night. 2. Cooping. Others believe that Poe fell victim to a practice known as cooping, a method of voter fraud practiced by gangs in the 19th century, where an unsuspecting victim would be kidnapped, disguised, and forced to vote for a specific candidate multiple times under multiple disguised identities. Voter fraud was extremely common in Baltimore around the mid-1800s, and the polling site where Walker found the disheveled Poe was a known place that coopers brought their victims. The fact that Poe was found delirious on election day, then, is no coincidence. Over the years, the cooping theory has come to be one of the more widely accepted explanations for Poe's strange demeanor before his death. Before Prohibition, voters were given alcohol after voting as a sort of reward. Had Poe been forced to vote multiple times in a cooping scheme, that might explain his semi-conscious, ragged state. Around the late 1870s, Poe's biographer J.H. Ingram received several letters that blamed Poe's death on a cooping scheme. A letter from William Hand Brown, a member of the faculty at Johns Hopkins University, explains that the general belief here is that Poe was seized by one of these gangs, his death happening just at election time. An election for sheriff took place on October 4th, cooped, stupefied with liquor, dragged out and voted, and then turned adrift to die. 3. Alcohol. A lot of the ideas that have come up over the years have centered around the fact that Poe couldn't handle alcohol, says Sempner. It has been documented that after a glass of wine, he was staggering drunk. His sister had the same problem. It seems to be something hereditary. Months before his death, Poe became a vocal member of the temperance movement, eschewing alcohol, which he'd struggled with all his life. Biographer Susan Archer Tally Weiss recalls, in The Last Days of Edgar A. Poe, an event toward the end of Poe's time in Richmond that might be relevant to theorists who prefer a death-by-drinking demise for Poe. Poe had fallen ill in Richmond, and after making a somewhat miraculous recovery, was told by his attending physician that another such attack would prove fatal. According to Weiss, Poe replied that if people would not tempt him, he would not fall, suggesting that the first illness was brought on by a bout of drinking. José around Poe during his final days seemed convinced that the author did indeed fall into that temptation, drinking himself to death. As his close friend J.P. Kennedy wrote on October 10, 1849, "On Tuesday last Edgar A. Poe died in town here at the hospital from the effects of a debauch. He fell in with some companion here who seduced him to the bottle, which it was said he had renounced some time ago. The consequence was fever, delirium, and madness, and in a few days a termination of his sad career in the hospital. Poor Poe. A bright but unsteady light has been awfully quenched." Though the theory that Poe's drinking led to his death fails to explain his 5-day disappearance or his second-hand clothes on October 3rd, it was nonetheless a popular theory propagated by Snodgrass after Poe's death. Snodgrass, a member of the temperance movement, gave lectures across the country, blaming Poe's death on binge drinking. Modern science, however, has thrown a wrench into Snodgrass's talking points. Samples of Poe's hair from after his death show low levels of lead, explains Sempner, which is an indication that Poe remained faithful to his vow of sobriety up until his demise. However, none of the theories fully explain Poe's curious end.